She was the kind of woman people saw every day and somehow never really saw at all. Each morning, she moved through the world with quiet precision. The same measured steps, the same gentle nods, the same soft expression that never asked for anything. To most people, she was just part of the background. Someone who existed without demanding attention. Someone easy to forget the moment she passed by. But if anyone had paused long enough to truly look, they would have noticed the weight she carried in her eyes. There was something there. Not sadness exactly, but a deep, patient tiredness. The kind that comes from holding too many memories alone. The kind that forms when a person learns over time that speaking doesn't always change anything. So they stopped trying. People assumed her life was simple because she kept it that way. No loud laughter. No dramatic complaints. No stories spilling out in long conversations. When asked how she was, her answer was always the same. "I'm fine." It was a word she had perfected. Polite. Efficient. She understood the rhythm of being overlooked. In fact, she had grown used to it. When gatherings filled with voices, she stayed at the edges. When decisions were made, her opinion was rarely requested. And when problems arose, people noticed her only when they needed something done quietly and without fuss. And she did it. Every time. What no one realized was how much strength it took to live like that. To give without being seen. To listen without being heard. To show up day after day, even when no one noticed the effort. At night, when the world finally grew quiet, she allowed herself small moments of honesty. Sitting alone, she would stare into the distance, her thoughts drifting to places she never spoke about. There were dreams once, not foolish ones, not grand ones, just gentle hopes of being understood, of being chosen, of being more than useful. Those dreams had not disappeared. They had simply learned to stay quiet. Sometimes, she caught her reflection in a window or mirror and studied it as if it belonged to someone else. She would wonder when she became this invisible version of herself. When being needed replaced being known. When silence became easier than explanation. Yet even in her invisibility, there was dignity. She carried herself with a calm grace that couldn't be taught. She never raised her voice. Never demanded sympathy. Never told her story. Not because it didn't matter, but because she believed the world wasn't listening. And perhaps that belief had been shaped by years of proof. Still, beneath the quiet routines and the overlooked presence, something waited. A truth that had not faded. A life that had not ended, only paused. The kind of story that doesn't announce itself loudly, but when finally heard, changes the way people see everything. She didn't know it yet, but her silence was not emptiness. It was a story gathering strength. And soon, whether she was ready or not, the world would be forced to notice the woman it had overlooked for far too long. Her smile was practiced, not false, just carefully measured. It appeared at the right moments, lingered just long enough, and disappeared without leaving questions behind. To anyone watching, it looked like contentment. To those who didn't look closely, it was proof that her life had been easy. But smiles can be shelters. And hers hid a past that had learned to stay silent. Long before her days settled into predictable routines, there had been a time when she laughed freely. When her voice filled rooms instead of shrinking inside them. Back then, she believed that effort was always rewarded, that love was something you earned by giving enough of yourself. She learned otherwise. The past didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, in expectations placed gently on her shoulders, in responsibilities framed as kindness, in choices presented as temporary but somehow became permanent. Each time she adjusted, telling herself it was just for now. Each time she smiled and said yes. Those years taught her a dangerous lesson. That being agreeable made life easier for everyone else. There were moments when she wanted to speak. When the words rose to her throat, heavy and urgent. But each time she considered it, she weighed the cost. Disappointment. Conflict. The risk of being seen as difficult. And so she swallowed the truth and replaced it with politeness. Over time, politeness became a language of survival. People praised her for being strong, for being understanding, for never complaining. They called her dependable. selfless, kind. No one noticed how those compliments quietly locked her into a role she never auditioned for. The memories she carried were not dramatic tragedies. There were no grand betrayals or sudden endings. Just a long series of small erasures. Opportunities passed over. Desires postponed. Parts of herself folded away to make space for others. She remembered specific moments, standing somewhere unfamiliar, realizing a choice had been made without her voice in it. Sitting through conversations where her future was discussed as if she were not present. Nodding along, smiling, convincing herself that this was what maturity looked like. And so the past was buried, not because it was unimportant, but because it was inconvenient. The smile became her disguise. It told the world everything was fine, kept questions away. It allowed her to move through life without having to explain what she had lost or why she felt a quiet ache she could never name. But buried things do not disappear. They wait. Sometimes, in unexpected moments, the past would stir. Familiar song. Careless remark. A glimpse of someone living the life she once imagined. In those moments, her smile would tighten just slightly, a reflex no one noticed. She never spoke of who she had been, or who she might have become. Not because she had forgotten, but because remembering hurt more than forgetting ever could. Still, beneath the polite smiles and carefully managed expressions, the past remained, patient, unresolved, and quietly alive. And one day it would demand to be acknowledged. The world rarely notices sacrifices that are made without noise. Hers had no announcement, no witnesses, no dramatic moment where everything changed at once. It happened slowly, folded into ordinary days, disguised as responsibility. What others called doing the right thing, she experienced as letting go again and again. There was a time when she stood at the edge of a different life. Not a perfect one, not an easy one, but one that felt like it belonged to her. It asked for courage. It asked for risk. And for a brief moment she almost said yes. But life had other plans, delivered through familiar voices and unspoken expectations. Someone needed her. Then someone else. And soon, need became a constant presence in her life. Heavy, persuasive, impossible to ignore. Each request came wrapped in reason. Each delay seemed temporary. She told herself there would be time later. There always wasn't. She learned how to adjust her dreams without fully abandoning them. How to keep them small enough to fit into the corners of her life. How to tell herself that fulfillment could wait, that duty came first, that love meant compromise. What she didn't realize was how invisible those compromises would become to everyone else. People saw the results of her sacrifice but never the cost. They benefited from her reliability without understanding what it required of her. When things went smoothly, it was expected. When things fell apart, she was the one called to fix them. And she did. Not because she was asked politely, but because she had been conditioned to believe that her worth was measured by how much she could endure without complaint. Saying no felt selfish. Choosing herself felt like betrayal. So she stayed. She postponed. She rearranged her life around other people's comfort, telling herself this was what strength looked like. Over time, the sacrifice became permanent. What once felt like a pause turned into a pattern. Opportunities passed quietly, leaving behind a faint sense of something unfinished. She watched from a distance as others stepped into futures she had once imagined for herself. She smiled for them. She meant it. But the smile always cost her something. At night, when the world grew quiet, the weight of what she had given up settled in. Not as anger, but as a deep, hollow understanding. She wondered who she might have been if circumstances had been different. If she had spoken sooner. If she had chosen differently just once. But those questions had no audience. So she carried them alone. No one marked the moment she sacrificed her own path. There was no recognition, no gratitude, no acknowledgement that something precious had been laid down and never picked up again. Yet the sacrifice mattered. Even if it went unnoticed. Even if it was misunderstood as weakness instead of quiet courage. Because the truest sacrifices are not the ones people applaud. They are the ones no one ever realizes were made at all. and hers was one of them. Silence did not arrive suddenly in her life. It grew slowly, the way habits do, quietly, almost unnoticed. First she spoke. She explained herself. She tried to be understood. When something hurt, she searched for the right words, believing that clarity would bring care, that honesty would be met with kindness. But each time she opened her mouth, she learned a little more about how the world truly listened. Sometimes her words were dismissed as overthinking. Sometimes they were met with polite nods and no change. And sometimes they were used against her. So she adjusted. She began choosing which thoughts were worth sharing and which were safer kept inside. She learned that silence could protect her from disappointment, from arguments, from being misunderstood. It spared her the exhausting work of explaining feelings no one seemed prepared to carry. Over time, silence stopped being a reaction and became a strategy. She discovered its power. When she said less, people assumed more. They filled the gaps with their own interpretations, usually kinder than the truth. Silence allowed her to avoid conflict without surrendering her dignity. It gave her control in a world where control often felt out of reach. But shields, no matter how strong, have weight. Carrying silence required constant awareness. She had to measure her expressions, soften her reactions, swallow questions before they formed. She learned how to appear calm even when her thoughts were loud. How to smile when speaking felt dangerous. How to let moments pass without correcting what was wrong. People mistook her quietness for peace. They said she was easy to be around, that she never caused trouble, that she was strong. What they didn't see was how much effort it took to maintain that image. How every unspoken word pressed gently against her chest, accumulating over time. There were nights when the silence felt unbearable. When she sat alone, replaying conversations in her mind, imagining what she might have said if she had believed it would matter. In those moments, the shield felt less like protection and more like a wall she had built around herself. Yet she kept it. Because silence had saved her more times than words ever had. It kept her safe from confrontation. It allowed her to endure without breaking. It helped her survive situations where speaking would have cost her more than staying quiet. Still, something essential was lost in the process. The longer she stayed silent, the harder it became to speak at all. Her voice, once certain, once hopeful, grew unfamiliar. She began to doubt whether her thoughts deserved space, whether her feelings were worth the effort of expression. And so, silence remained. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned that being unheard hurt more than being quiet. What no one realized was that her silence was not weakness. It was armor, forged through experience, polished by necessity, and worn every day to survive a world that rarely listened. But even the strongest shields cannot protect forever. And deep inside, something was beginning to stir, a voice that had waited long enough. It happened on a day that looked like any other. No warning, no special occasion. Just an ordinary moment that should have passed unnoticed, the way most moments in her life always did. She was in the middle of her routine, moving with the same quiet efficiency, her silence neatly in place, when someone did something unexpected. They paused. Not out of politeness, not out of habit, but with intention. For the first time in a long while, someone looked at her closely. Not at what she was doing, not at what she provided, but at her. Their gaze didn't rush past her or skim the surface. It lingered, curious and attentive, as if they sensed there was more beneath the calm exterior. It unsettled her. She felt the instinct to retreat, to offer the familiar smile, to reassure them that everything was fine, that nothing needed to be asked, that nothing needed to be seen. But before she could do that, the moment stretched just long enough to make escape impossible. "Are you okay?" the person asked. It was a simple question, one she had heard countless times before. But this time it was different. There was no hurry in the voice. No expectation of a quick answer. Just space, something she was no longer used to being given. For a second, she didn't know how to respond. Her practiced reply waited at the edge of her lips, ready to protect her. "I'm fine." It always worked. It always ended the conversation. But something about the way she was being seen made that word feel suddenly dishonest and frightening. She hesitated, just enough for the silence to shift. That hesitation revealed more than any confession could have. It exposed the careful balance she maintained, the effort behind her calm, the fatigue she had grown so skilled at hiding. The person noticed. They didn't interrupt. They didn't rescue her from the pause. They simply stayed. No one had ever stayed before. In that quiet space, she felt something unfamiliar. Permission. Permission to not perform. Permission to be uncertain. Permission to exist without immediately making herself useful. She didn't pour out her story. She didn't explain her past or name her sacrifices. All she did was breathe differently. Her shoulders softened. Her eyes dropped, not in shame but in relief. It was enough. That small moment cracked something open inside her. A realization she hadn't allowed herself before. That being seen didn't always lead to loss. That attention didn't have to be dangerous. That not everyone would demand something in return. The person didn't push for more. They didn't insist. They respected the boundaries she still needed. But they left behind something powerful, awareness. After that day, she moved through the world slightly differently. Still quiet. Still reserved. But no longer entirely invisible. She began to notice how often she had been overlooked, and how deeply it had shaped her. Someone had looked closely, and in doing so, had reminded her that she existed beyond her role. She didn't know it yet, but that moment marked the beginning of a shift. Because once you are truly seen, even once, it becomes impossible to return completely to the shadows. Some truths are not hidden because they are dangerous. They are hidden because once spoken, nothing can return to the way it was. After the day someone truly looked at her, something inside her loosened. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden change in her behavior, no bold declarations. But the silence she carried began to shift, no longer sealed as tightly as before. Memories she had carefully organized and locked away started to resurface. Not all at once, not violently. They appeared quietly, in fragments. A decision she never questioned. A moment she had accepted too easily. A path she had followed because it seemed expected, not because it felt right. Each memory arrived with a clarity that had been missing before. She began to recognize patterns. How often she had been the one to adjust. How rarely anyone had asked if she wanted to. How many times her consent had been assumed simply because she didn't object. The truth settled in slowly, heavy but undeniable. Much of her life had been shaped by what she didn't say. This realization frightened her. It challenged the story she had told herself for years, that silence was strength, that endurance was virtue, that sacrifice was always noble. Now she saw the cost more clearly. And once seen, it could not be unseen. She didn't share these thoughts with anyone. Not yet. Truths like these required careful handling. They had the power to disrupt relationships, to invite uncomfortable questions, to expose wounds others preferred to keep covered. Still, they demanded space. In quiet moments, she found herself replaying conversations differently. Noticing where her voice had been absent. Understanding how easily people had grown accustomed to her compliance. It wasn't blame she felt, not toward others and not toward herself, but something closer to grief. Grief for the person she might have been if her needs had mattered sooner. Some truths are not accusations. They are awakenings. As these realizations surfaced, she felt torn between fear and relief. Fear of what acknowledging them might require. Relief that the unease she had carried for so long finally had a name. She understood now why these truths had remained buried. They threatened the balance she had spent years maintaining. Speaking them would mean change. And change had always come at a cost she wasn't sure she could afford. Yet the past was no longer content to remain silent. The truths rose gently but persistently, asking to be recognized. Not shouted, not displayed, simply honored. They didn't demand action, not yet. They asked for honesty. And honesty, she realized, was the first thing she had ever denied herself. These truths were never meant to surface because they required courage. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that begins with admitting something inwardly, before ever saying it aloud. She wasn't ready to share them with the world. But she could no longer pretend they didn't exist. And that, in itself, changed everything. Time has a way of becoming heavier the longer it goes unexamined. Once the truths surfaced, regret followed closely behind, not as a sudden wave but as a steady presence. It settled into her thoughts, quiet but persistent, asking questions she had avoided for years. What if? Why didn't I? When did I stop choosing myself? These questions did not come with easy answers. Regret, she learned, is rarely about one decision. It is about patterns. About all the small moments where she had chosen peace over truth, acceptance over honesty, safety over desire. None of those choices had felt wrong at the time. They had felt necessary, reasonable, kind. And that was what made the regret so complicated. She didn't blame anyone else. Guilt made sure of that. Guilt whispered that she had agreed, that she had smiled, that she had stayed quiet. It reminded her that no one had forced her hand, at least not in ways that could be easily named. Guilt is heavy because it convinces you that suffering was your responsibility. She carried it with her daily, measuring her past with a harshness she had never applied to anyone else. She judged herself for not speaking sooner, for not leaving earlier, for not demanding more when she still felt she had the right to. But guilt ignored context. It ignored the pressure, the expectations, the emotional costs of defiance. It ignored how survival sometimes disguises itself as choice. Time added another layer to the weight she carried. With every passing year, the idea of change began to feel more distant. Not impossible, just harder to imagine. Time had a way of shrinking possibilities, or at least convincing her that it had. The longer she stayed where she was, the more permanent it seemed. She told herself it was too late. Not because she truly believed it, but because believing otherwise felt terrifying. There were moments when she looked back with sharp clarity, seeing exactly where the road forked, exactly when she might have chosen differently. Those moments hurt the most. They made the past feel close enough to touch and far enough to grieve. Yet regret was not the only thing time carried. It also carried understanding. With distance came compassion, slow, reluctant, but growing. She began to see her younger self not as weak, but as trying her best with the tools she had. She recognized the fear, the hope, the careful calculations behind each decision. This softened something inside her. The weight of time did not disappear, but it shifted. It became less about punishment and more about recognition. Less about blame and more about acknowledgement. Regret showed her what mattered. Guilt showed her what she had survived. Time showed her that awareness, even late, was still awareness. She wasn't sure what she would do with these realizations yet. But she knew one thing for certain. Carrying regret in silence was no longer an option. Because time does not only take. Sometimes it gives clarity, honesty, and the chance to finally listen to yourself. Courage is often imagined as something loud. A dramatic decision. Public stand. A moment that demands attention. But the courage that changed her life did not look like that at all. It arrived quietly, without witnesses, and almost went unnoticed, just like so many things she had done before. For days after the weight of regret settled in, she did nothing different on the outside. Her routines remained intact. Her voice stayed calm. Her expressions stayed measured. Anyone watching would have assumed nothing had shifted. But inside, something had begun to resist. It wasn't anger. It wasn't rebellion. It was a subtle refusal, a growing awareness that continuing exactly as she always had would mean betraying herself in ways she could no longer ignore. The quiet act of courage began with a pause. When a familiar expectation surfaced, the kind she would normally accept without question, she hesitated. Just for a moment. Long enough to feel the discomfort rise. Long enough to notice how automatic her compliance had become. And then, gently, she chose differently. There was no announcement, no explanation, no defense of her decision. She didn't justify herself or seek permission. She simply declined. Only, respectfully, without apology. The moment passed quickly. Too quickly for anyone else to fully register its significance. But for her it was monumental. Her heart raced, not because she feared consequences, but because she had crossed an invisible boundary she had never crossed before. She had honored a feeling instead of silencing it. She had trusted her inner voice, however unfamiliar it felt. Nothing fell apart. That realization was just as powerful as the decision itself. The world did not collapse because she said no. Relationships did not immediately unravel. The fears that had kept her quiet for so long failed to materialize, at least not in the way she had imagined. Encouraged, she made another small choice. And then another. Each one barely noticeable to others, yet transformative to her. She began protecting her time, speaking a little more honestly, allowing herself rest without guilt. These were not acts of defiance. They were acts of self-respect. Courage, she learned, didn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it required consistency. The willingness to keep choosing yourself in small ways, even when no one applauds. There were moments when doubt crept in. When old habits tugged at her, reminding her how easy it was to disappear into silence again. But now she recognized that pattern. And recognition made resistance possible. Her courage did not demand recognition. It didn't seek validation. It existed quietly, steadily reshaping the way she moved through her life. This was not a transformation anyone would celebrate publicly. But it was the bravest thing she had ever done. Because choosing yourself after years of silence is not dramatic. It is deliberate. And in that quiet courage she began, slowly, carefully, to reclaim her life. Healing did not arrive with relief the way she had imagined. There was no sudden sense of freedom. No moment where everything felt lighter at once. Instead, healing came quietly, almost shyly, settling into her life in ways that were easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Just like her. After the quiet acts of courage, she expected to feel different. Stronger, clearer, more certain. What she felt instead was unfamiliar. Tender. Suppose. Healing, she realized, often comes after the armor is lowered. And that vulnerability can feel like weakness before it feels like growth. Some days she questioned herself. Was she being selfish? Had she waited too long? Were these small changes really enough to matter? Old doubts surfaced, echoing voices she had internalized over years. Healing didn't silence those voices immediately. It taught her how to listen without obeying them. Progress was subtle. It showed up in moments that didn't look important. Choosing rest without guilt. Speaking honestly without rehearsing every word. Allowing herself to feel disappointment without rushing to fix it. These moments didn't draw attention, but they built something steady inside her. Healing also required patience. There were setbacks. Days when silence crept back in, familiar and tempting. Days when it felt easier to return to old patterns than to maintain new ones. She learned not to punish herself for these moments. Healing wasn't about perfection. It was about return, coming back to herself again and again. She stopped expecting closure. Not every wound demanded explanation. Not every past choice required correction. Some things would remain unfinished, and learning to live with that became part of her healing. Acceptance didn't erase pain, but it softened its edges. One of the most difficult lessons was this. Healing did not require anyone else's acknowledgement. There were no apologies offered. No dramatic recognition of her sacrifices. The world did not suddenly understand what she had carried. And surprisingly, she began to realize she didn't need it to. Her healing was internal, private, honest. She felt it in the way her breath settled more easily. In the way her shoulders relaxed without conscious effort. In the way her inner voice grew kinder, less demanding. Healing didn't change her history. Changed her relationship with it. She no longer viewed her past solely as something that had taken from her. She began to see it as proof of resilience. evidence that she had survived with grace, even when unseen. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she felt whole in ways she never had before. No one applauded her healing. No one announced it. But healing isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It lives in the quiet confidence of knowing yourself again, not as you were expected to be, but as you truly are. And that quiet was finally beginning to feel like peace. For most of her life, her silence had been misunderstood. People thought it meant agreement. They assumed it meant contentment. Some even believed it meant weakness. No one stopped to consider that silence could be a language, one shaped by endurance, restraint, and quiet strength. But over time something changed. As she began living differently, not loudly, not dramatically, people around her noticed subtle shifts. She was still kind, still calm, still thoughtful. But she was no longer endlessly available, no longer invisible. Her presence carried a quiet firmness that hadn't been there before. And it made people reflect. Some felt confused. Others felt unsettled. Few felt challenged. Without ever raising her voice, she had altered the dynamic. Her silence was no longer an invitation to overlook her. Had become a boundary. Those closest to her began to see what they had missed. They noticed how often she had adapted to others. How rarely she had been asked what she wanted. How easily they had taken her steadiness for granted. These realizations didn't come with guilt at first. They came with surprise. The world, after all, doesn't expect quiet people to carry heavy stories. Her silence taught them that strength doesn't always announce itself. That resilience doesn't require noise. That the people who ask for the least often give the most. It also taught them something uncomfortable. That overlooking someone is often easier than truly seeing them. She didn't lecture. She didn't explain. She didn't demand recognition. Her life, lived more honestly now, did the teaching for her. Every gentle refusal, every moment of self-respect, quietly challenged old assumptions. Some people adjusted. Some didn't. And she learned that was okay. One of the most powerful lessons her silence offered was this. Understanding cannot be forced. Must be chosen. Those who were willing to look more closely did. Those who weren't continued as before. But she no longer shaped herself around their limitations. Her story became a mirror for others. A reminder to listen beyond words. To notice who always steps back, who always accommodates, who never asks to be heard. It urged them to question what they assume about quiet people. In the end, her silence taught everyone something different. To some, it was a lesson in humility. To others, a lesson in awareness. And to a few, a lesson in compassion. But the most important lesson was the one she learned herself. Silence had protected her when she needed it. But it no longer defined her. She had found her voice. Not in volume, but in truth. Not in performance, but in presence. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. That a life lived quietly can still speak volumes. If we are willing to listen.